I've repeatedly found that what's most important for me to understand is also what tends to be clouded in the most misinformation. And that makes sense from a conspiratorial point of view, where if you recognize that there are actually folks trying to disempower populations, that they would put particular effort in causing confusion concerning what would actually empower the people the most. So, certain ideas, certain truths are going to be attacked, you know, with particular misinformation, right? So, another way I've come to realize this is true is just the immensity of the bullshit surrounding these issues of most important. For example, you can look into what's called social contract theory. So people trying to put forth this idea of this social contract that we've all supposedly agreed to through implicit consent, right? That's just going to be a giant mountain of bullshit. And also, it's of extreme importance. That's why there's so much bullshit over it. But I'm not going to be talking about social contract theory here. I want to talk about something on what you could say is crucial on like the personal level, or religious, spiritual level. Although it's all interconnected. But that is the topic of self-love. So again, if you want to observe or read, I know it sounds kind of like an exercise in giving yourself a headache, but look up what mainstream church authorities say about self-love, and you're going to find again another giant mountain of nonsense, a giant mountain of bullshit. So first of all, what is self-love, right? That's clouded from the get-go. Is self-love bad? Okay. And why, and then I'll get to why is this such an important issue? It might seem like not that big of a thing. We've definitely been discouraged from focusing on self-love, and I'll get to what I've discovered the reason for that is. But let's just first look at what is said about self-love. So, firstly, it's equated with, for the most part, what I observe is it's equated with conceitedness. It's just right off the bat, first thing they do is equate it with conceitedness. So they're saying a form of love is actually conceitedness, or that when love is directed at yourself, it equals conceitedness. So think about that. Does that actually make sense? Is that logical? Why would love become something negative just because you turn it towards yourself, right? Why is it good to love another person or to love God, but if you were to direct the love towards yourself, how is the self inward directing make it evil? You see, that's the question. Imagine love is like a beam of energy, like coming out of your eyes or something, right? So you're looking at someone else with love. Okay, that's good, right? Like night, everyone's going to agree that's a good thing. Or imagine you're looking at God, if you could look directly at God somehow, and you're looking at him with love. They're all going to say, "Oh, that's great." Okay, but now you look at yourself. Oh, no, 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 don't do that. So just on a logical point of view, right? Just with basic reasoning, does that make sense? Try and forget about all the things you've heard about self-love. If love is good, if it's good to love someone else and it's good to love God, why would simply directing that good energy, right? I think it's pretty much the majority view on planet Earth that, love is a great energy. It's the best energy, right? It's pure goodness. why would simply just directing it at yourself, why is the steering of that energy toward yourself evil, right? If it's a good energy, like, wouldn't it be good to just spread that energy all around, right? Like, what? How does it make sense that excluding yourself, right? You're part of this universe, right? You're another human being on the planet. Why does it make sense that, like, you want to spread love to all the world except yourself? Like, how does that what I'm saying is it's logically inconsistent, right? It doesn't make any sense to say, okay, love is this pure good energy, but you don't want to direct it at the human being, which is yourself. Any other human being, that's great, but not you. You're the human being that does not deserve that loving gaze, right? Okay. So what they say is that in the act of steering that loving energy toward yourself, somehow in that motion inward, it then transforms. The loving energy doesn't stay actually good. It becomes contaminated, like, imagine you're like steering a car, right? You're going 90 degrees. Okay, now you're approaching the 180 towards yourself. It's getting like dirtier and dirtier. And then once it hits 180, oh, now it's terrible. Now it's this evil, dark energy just because you've turned it towards yourself. Again, that doesn't actually make any sense. But maybe you could argue, okay, well, that's just the metaphysical reality, that it does actually change. Love does, when you turn it towards yourself, it does actually metaphysically on the quantum level become a different kind of energy. Okay, I suppose you could hold that belief, but does that hold up to scrutiny? That's the question to ask yourself here. Jesus said that the greatest commandments are to love God and to love others as ourselves. Now, if you go to a Christian pastor or priest and you ask them, what did Jesus mean when he said, love others as ourself, as yourself? What does the as yourself mean? It's safe to say that you're going to then hear a bunch of bullshit, basically, because the institutional church is anti self love. So even though on just, reading it, if you were to just read it without any preconceptions and just, okay, what does this phrase mean? Well, logically it means love yourself too, right? Because it wouldn't make any, it would again be logically inconsistent for Jesus to say, love others as yourself, but you don't love yourself, right? Because if you don't love yourself and then you're loving others as yourself, well, then you're not loving others either, right? So it logically requires that you love yourself, right? So it's just nonsense, just, on a, I don't want to say grammatical, but, just the meaning of the words, the meaning of what he's saying makes no sense if you don't actually love yourself. So I looked up a couple articles. If you just do a search for, like, what does the Bible say about self-love, you'll take a journey to the mountain of bullshit. And some of what I found in the foothills was this idea. Basically, this is a logical fallacy called logic chopping. It's when someone clouds an issue. They nitpick or quibble in a trivial manner that actually just distracts from the real message or the real meaning. In this case, they'll nitpick the words as yourself to avoid what the obvious meaning is, which again is just obviously saying love yourself too. So they'll say things like, well, Jesus was talking about 2 commandments. And then if we say that, he was also saying, love yourself. Well, then that's a third commandment. And he clearly didn't say third, nowhere in the Bible does Jesus say there's three commandments, right? So this is logic chopping, because loving others as yourself is one commandment in and of itself that has two aspects, right? So that's just retarded to think, to not be able to conceive that the commandment can have like two aspects, right? Love others as yourself is one commandment. As yourself, loving yourself is one aspect of that one commandment. So it's just stupid. It's illogical. It's the logical fallacy known as nitpicking or logic chopping. Another article I found in the foothills of the mountain of bullshit on self-love in a Christian context was, again, nitpicking the words as yourself to, again, steer you away from the simple conclusion of self-love is actually a good thing, by saying, well, when he said as yourself, the way that those words, the grammar of those words indicates that it was a pre-existing mentality or pre-existing view. So he was just saying, again, putting Jesus words in Jesus's mouth, which the church loves to do. He was just saying that you already love yourself, so at least love. You should love others like you love yourself. But they'll say, but he wasn't actually saying self-love is good. He was just saying you already love yourself, and that's actually a bad thing, even though he didn't say that. It was implied. Right, there we go with implication, right? Like you gave implicit consent to governments. Well, Jesus implied, right? So just putting words into people's mouths, or it's just bullshit. So this is again that logic chopping by saying, well, because it's saying that you already loved yourself, it's assuming that there's a negative implication to that when there's no reason to assume that. So they're just making a negative assumption, twisting his words out of the common sense interpretation that you should make, so that it goes against self-love, right? And what is the main reason that they're going to, again, justify this anti-self-love perspective? Even if you don't believe really they're logic chopping, and you might say, well, I don't know, it still sounds like he's saying to love ourselves. Well, then undoubtedly they're just going to explain to you why self-love is actually conceitedness. And again, returning to my initial visualization, or whatever, my initial analogy or explanation of why it doesn't make any sense that if love is purely good, it doesn't make any sense why simply directing it at yourself then makes it bad, unless love becomes something other than love in the turning towards yourself, right? But why assume that would happen? Well, how, why assume, how is that based in reality that, emotions become their opposite simply when you turn them toward yourself? That just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I'm angry at someone else, but when I turn that anger towards myself, suddenly it becomes the opposite. Now I'm calm towards myself. What? It just doesn't, or flipping it in the same, in the same direction of, virtue versus sin. It would be, I'm calm. I have a calm view towards someone else, but as soon as I turn calmness towards myself, it becomes anger. Or, I have temperance for someone else, but as soon as I turn that temperance towards myself, it becomes craving, right? Or I have hope towards someone else, but as soon as I turn that hopefulness toward myself, it becomes depression, right? But worse than stupid is that it's deceptive. And that's really the main point that I want to get at here is that there's the actual conspiracy against self-love, and there's a very obvious reason for it, or a very clear, obvious to me now, clear reason why there would be such a conspiracy against self-love. And it's interesting because when you look into like spirituality and people talking about the law of attraction and manifestation, changing your life, sometimes you'll hear them talk about the issue of self-concept, and they'll say like, your self-concept is so important, or how you view yourself is so important. But before talking more on the spiritual side, I want to just talk a little bit more on the social engineering, the psychological warfare, propaganda side. So again, the reason why powers that be wouldn't want a population that loves themselves is because it's actually empowering to have self-love. And again, self-love is not equivalent to conceitedness. They're not the same thing. They want you to think that love, when directed at yourself, simply in the turning of the love toward yourself, it either, becomes conceitedness. That's, I think, the number one lie that they say. Or, they might also say it's like a solipsism, like you're just self-centered, like you think, oh, the whole world revolves around you. But again, just basically conceitedness, or that you're selfish, right? To have self-love is selfishness. It's like this, could also be a craving, kind of like covetousness, right? So again, turning a virtue, the ultimate virtue, or really like what all virtues combined equal, which is love, they're telling you that this virtue is actually a sin, simply by directing it at yourself, which again makes no sense. Yes, conceitedness is a sin. Yes, covetousness is a sin, but love is neither of those things. Why is this so hard to understand? If you love yourself, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're conceited, right? Just as in loving another person is a good thing, loving yourself is a good thing, because love is a good energy. It's not a negative energy. And in fact, what makes it even worse is that not only are they telling you that the ultimate virtue is a sin, but that they're telling you that sins are virtue. So namely, self-loathing is virtuous, right? Because if you don't love yourself, well, what does that mean, right? And this is where the toxic doctrine of inherited sin comes in, right? Wanting you to believe that you're inherently wicked, that you're fundamentally flawed. How does that jive with you were made in the image and likeness of God? It doesn't. Again, if you want to observe a mountain of bullshit, look into, the defenders of inherited sin doctrine. It's just a bunch of bullshit. Oh, yeah, you were made in the image of God, image and likeness of God, but because of what Adam did, then that trickled down through all your ancestry to you now. So you're actually not made in the image and likeness of God because of what Adam did. And even though the Bible says elsewhere that you can't, inherit the sins of your father, this is different, blah, blah, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. It's just clearly a pile of bullshit. Right? And so if you think you are inherently wicked, how are you going to love yourself, right? Because if you're sane, you wouldn't love wickedness, right? So they're pushing the depressed thinking of self-loathing, which is actually sinful, toxic, demonic thinking. And they're also getting you to be suspicious of yourself, to doubt yourself, right? also toxic thinking. They're also getting you to feel ashamed of yourself, to have this fear of humiliation, fear of being your true self. So, fear, suspiciousness, depressed thinking, all of this toxic, sinful thinking, they're telling you, oh, it's actually good. That's all good. You're such a good person for embracing all this toxicity in your head. And just think about it logically too, like how is it actually even serving, how does it serve you or others to hold on to this toxic thinking, right? It's so clearly not the way life works. When you observe people that really don't have any self-love, are they like champions of positive change in the world? No. Right? Like it's the people that have a healthy amount, healthy self-love that have the good energy within them to actually be able to love others. You may have heard the saying, right? Like you can't love others before you love yourself. Well, there's actually sense to that. If you don't take care of your own body, for example, if one manifestation of a lack of self-love is like you just totally neglect your own health, but say you have children, but now you're sick because you never took care of yourself and now you can't take care of your children. So how is that helping anybody, right? So like that's some logical reasons there on why self-love is a good thing. But never mind that. Believe all this bullshit about inherited sin and how self-love actually becomes, how love actually becomes conceitedness simply by directing it at yourself. Okay, and on the propaganda side, I was going to make a couple more points. So, what's interesting to observe in the social, political level is just how much they push identity politics, right? So, what is identity politics, right? It's having you identify with particular groups, antagonistic to one another, right? Having you identify as left or right, black or white, right? So, to just get right to the main point here, if you are actually made in the image and likeness of God, which I believe you are, that means that your spirit is actually purely good. Your true self is pure love. It's purely good. And it's a unique spirit. It's not a spirit that actually belongs to collectives, right? You could say you're, part of the collective of humanity, part of the collective of creation, but you're not in any of these subcategories that they try and box everyone in. So if you ask someone, who are you? And they say, oh, I'm this, this ethnicity, or I'm black, I'm white, you know, I'm, I identify with this government here or this government there. If they can get you to have a false identity, right, not only are you susceptible to being propagandized through that false self-concept, but you're also disempowered because knowing who you are is actually key for empowerment. So that's why Darwinism is still dominant in the educational system, in academia, even though if you look into it, it's again a giant mountain of bullshit. If you actually look into the supposed proofs of one species turning into another, guess what you're going to find? A whole lot of bullshit. Jonathan Wells has done an excellent job in exposing this bullshit along with many other authors, but if you just think, well, what are you talking about? Macroevolution is a fact. Everyone says it's a fact. Read Zombie Science by Jonathan Wells as a starting point. It's not a fact. It's a pile of bullshit. Your ancestors, your ancestry does not go back to pond scum, right? But they want you to believe that because that's disempowering and it's a false self-concept. And again, self-concept is actually key. That's why people who are just all about all the leftist, Marxist communist craziness tend to be believers in Darwinism, materialists, atheists, and all about identity politics, right? They just view everything through the lens of identity politics. They just immediately, whenever they look at anybody, they just immediately think of their, so-called race first, or, whatever first. They don't look at this other person as like, oh, here's a human being. Let me see what this individual is about. It's all about the group think, collectivism, It's all about not viewing people as individuals, right? It's all about the group. And going along with that is, for the greater good, we can violate the rights of the individual, right? So they go against the perfect law, which is the law of love, and they say, oh, there's actually exceptions. It's actually okay to not be loving towards others, if, and then, they just add on their bullshit supposed exceptions to the rule, like if they declare an emergency, or if they say it's for the greater good, or, if they say safety 500 times. Like, that's just the main blunder that humanity's been suffering from for centuries, which is thinking that there's exceptions to this rule, to this ultimate law of love, that sometimes it's actually okay to be abusive, particularly towards individuals or small groups, because it's for the greater good of, the group as a whole. So, groupthink and satanic politics go hand in hand. And groupthink depends on not having what you could say is like individual think or just correct think, which is recognizing that we are actually all individuals, and individuals that do have a spirit that is fundamentally good. But you may say, wait a minute, if everyone's so fundamentally good, why is the world so messed up? Well, because they don't recognize the truth about themselves, and they don't recognize that not only are they not one and the same with these external groups that, propaganda wants to have us believe, we all belong to, but also there's actually internal elements, these emotional elements, that are not our true self either. And when you listen to good teachers on religion or spirituality or psychology, you may hear them say things like, you need to disidentify, right? The famous author Eckhart Tolle talks about like the pain body, and the key is to disidentify, to no longer identify with those toxic thoughts, right? Well, if you're not identifying with them, and that's the correct thing to do, then that means you are not them, right? You are not actually the fear, the anger, the depression, the sloth, the depression, the suspiciousness, the craving, the mischievousness, or the conceitedness. Yes, you can, and we often do follow those, and then it leads to sabotaging our life and causing disturbance to others as well. But that's not actually who we are fundamentally. We've been tricked internally. That's the internal propaganda, to cling to those toxic emotions as if they are our own self, right? And again, returning to like the worst propagandized people, they're all about emotions too, right? Almost everything they say starts with I feel, right? Well, why is that? Because they identify with these emotions, particularly, these toxic emotions, right? So their whole life revolves around identifying with what is toxic, externally and internally. And so that's why they just make everything terrible around them, they're hell-bent on making the world more hellish, even though they don't necessarily realize that. It's because they're being deceived internally and externally to make these false identifications, which are not who they truly are. When they were a little baby, they didn't have they didn't have these thoughts. They didn't have this way of thinking and being. It was, imposed on them. We've been bombarded by it. And every day in the media, especially in the educational system, it's just bombarding you with all of this propaganda to make you identify not only with externalities that are not really who you are, but also with internal phenomena, which is not who you are, namely these 8 toxic emotion thoughts, which again are fear, sloth, anger, depression, suspiciousness, craving, mischievousness, and conceitedness. None of which are compatible with love. So this is another thing, that just makes no sense in mainstream Pauline Christianity, is that they'll support fear sometimes. They'll say, well, fear of the Lord is good. Even though in one of John's letters, he says explicitly, right, love and fear are incompatible, which is correct. Love and fear are incompatible. And so it's the same is true with anger. You might say, oh, well, what about righteous indignation? What about righteous anger when I see an injustice? That's not actually love. You can work against, speak against, fight against an injustice without anger. Anger actually sabotages justice being done. So it's just all these false equivalencies, assumptions, and immoral ways of thinking that supposedly justify or rationalize or, prove that these toxic emotions are actually sometimes useful, when in fact they never are. So if these 8 toxic emotion thoughts are incompatible with love, that again makes sense in this psycho-spiritual context wherein who you are fundamentally is pure love. So if who you are fundamentally is pure love, how can a fearful thought be your own thought? Right? You can't have the opposite emanate, from something. That's a fundamental law of logic, right? I think it is what it is, and it's not the opposite of what it is, right? So if fear and love are incompatible and you're pure love, well, then you're not the fearful thought, and you're not the angry thought, you're not the depressed thought, you're not the slothful thought, the craving thought, the mischievous thought, the conceited thought, the mischievous thought, right? And that's why when you follow them, it causes disharmony within and without. And now just to close and return to the spiritual side, it's interesting to hear some of the folks on the spiritual side, or you could say the spiritual community, talking about self-concept. And a few will hit on the right idea, which is that actually that's key. The self-love is key. And some of them are even good in pointing out, when I say self-love, I'm not saying, get all conceited and in your ego. Ego just being a blanket term that's used to actually refer to the toxic 8 emotion thoughts. They'll say, self-love is just having that good loving energy directed towards yourself at times, just as, it's good for you to direct it towards others. And so if there's truth to what they talk about, where, the outside world actually is reflected by our own thinking, right? Some quotes along those lines I wrote down. One is, look at your outside circumstances and possessions as a reflection of how you view yourself. What you think, especially about yourself, is always reflecting back to you. So when self-love is your base resonance, you'll raise your vibration to, quote unquote, attract a better life. Or maybe take away the quotes. Maybe it's all right actually to say this word attract. It's not who you are that holds you back. It's what you think you're not that does, right? So if how we view ourselves is actually fundamental to making our lives better, more healthy and empowered, well, then wicked people that want to control and abuse humanity would be adamant about getting people to have an anti-self-love view, right? And one way of actually doing that is demoralizing people, getting them to, you know, fall into immorality, because then there would be reason for having more of the self-loathing, right? If you're looking at yourself as this immoral being, well, where is the self-love going to be, or the love for others, right? It's just getting to look at yourself as kind of like trash, getting to look at everyone else as the same, and then it makes sense that we would need these, zookeepers to manage these animals that have no moral core, right? It's the opposite of the phrase or the word namaste, which you probably have heard, and I think oftentimes kind of gets made fun of, which means, the divine in me honors the divine in you. And it's the opposite of that. It's like an anti-namaste worldview. And just on like the self-help, self-improvement, therapy side of things, um, the smart, accurate folks will say things like, the root cause of limiting beliefs is actually a false self-identity. So again, it comes back to having an unloving view of yourself, lack of self-love, right? That's what a false self-identity is. It's lack of self-love, right? Because if you think you're fundamentally flawed, that you have this inherited sin, you're not going to love yourself. And then that being fundamental to limiting beliefs, and then limiting beliefs being fundamental to negative behavioral patterns that not only sabotage our own lives, but can end up hurting others too. It all comes down to know thyself, right? Know that you are actually made in the image and likeness of God. And from that self-love, you can then love others as yourself and love the Creator who created you in his image and likeness, which is perfectly good, which is pure love. All right, so I'll just leave it there. I hope you found some of this insightful and helpful. Thanks for listening.